Hey there, it's Katie from CreativeHealingPhilly.com, and today I want to talk to you about the idea of change. So let's talk about change. As the summer is upon us, this means that there are changes that are coming up for our teens, whether it's getting a summer job, having a less structured summer, going to summer camp or summer school, spending less or more time with friends. And then there's also the possibility of college on the horizon for some of our teens, or maybe even a new school. So change is scary, and what happens is when we sense a change, it makes most people feel anxious, right? Because there's a lot of unknowns that come with that, and unknowns make most people anxious. It's in our nature to want to know and control what's ahead of us. Unfortunately, that's not always a reality. So what I wanted to do here for you today was talk about 2 tips for navigating change so that you can help your teen feel a little bit more comfortable with the process of changes that may be happening in their lives. So the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of change is being able to accept that change. Oftentimes, this is the hardest part, being able to say, like, I know that change is the only constant. In DBT, that's one dialectical behavior therapy, that's one of the foundations, is that change is the only constant. We can expect that things are always going to be changing around us. And I know that it's uncomfortable, but the point is that when we can accept that change is the only constant and begin to accept the discomfort that comes with that, it makes it easier to plan for how to cope. What happens is when we push up against struggle, it makes us struggle more because we're not accepting the reality of what's happening to us. So number 1 is always to accept that things are changing so that we can plan for the next step and how to cope with them. So number 2 is to cope ahead. Cope ahead is one of my favorite DBT skills because it allows us to develop a plan for what to do in the event of anything scary or unknown or uncomfortable or dangerous may possibly happen to us. So what I like to do with our teens is to develop a plan, first to play out the tape is what I call it, where we talk about what's the best case scenario here, what's the worst case scenario here, and what's the most likely scenario here. So once we have those 3 different scenarios played out to the very end and every single thing that could happen within them to the best of our knowledge, I like to help teens come up with a cope ahead strategy, meaning, well, what would you do if your best case scenario happened? How would you celebrate? How would you enjoy it? What would happen in your life? Who would you tell about it? What would you do if the worst case scenario happened? How would you troubleshoot it? Who would you talk to for support? What would you do to keep yourself safe? So we talk about the extremes first, the best and the worst case scenario, and then we talk about, like, what's most likely to happen here? What do you think is actually going to happen here? And what are you going to do when that thing most likely happens? So instead of ignoring the possibilities or minimizing, like, that's not going to happen, we really talk through, like, well, if it did happen, what would that be like for you? So what that does is it takes away some of the power of those unknowns by putting a bunch of things in place that help your teen conceptualize what could happen and what's actually likely to happen. The second part of coping ahead is talking about, what's been my pattern of things that have happened in the past and how have I coped with change in the past? And that's actually leading us into a really exciting activity that we're going to do in one of our DBT groups this week. So what I did was I went to the craft store today and I bought these tree rings that are really cool. I like to incorporate nature and crafts and interactive activities into our groups to really engage our teens. So if we think about the idea that a tree, when you cut it open, you see all the rings, and it's meant to tell the story of and the age of that tree based on the amount of rings that tree trunk has. So what I'm going to ask of our teens tonight is to write in tree rings all of the big life changes that they've had in the past. And we're going to talk about how they felt with them and how they dealt with them to help them recognize that they actually have coped with change in helpful and positive ways in the past. And if they haven't coped with change in helpful and positive ways in the past, we're going to troubleshoot and get them to the point of being able to cope in a more positive and effective way moving forward. So it really is a practice in looking at what changes have I already experienced in my life, how have I handled those changes, and how can I move forward more effectively and handle them in the best way possible to move me towards my ideal future self and live within my values. So that is what we'll be working on tonight, but it's also something that you can do with your children and teens at home, is help them work through what's the best and worst case scenario and what's the most likely thing that's going to happen, but how would I cope with any of these things should they happen in my life in a situation that's uncomfortable comfortable for me. So if you found this information helpful and your teen might need a little bit of help coping with worst case scenarios or coping with an upcoming change in their lives, we'd love to support you on that. Go ahead and reach out to us at creativehealingphilly.com. We have some groups that are enrolling for summer that would be a great place for your teen to get some of those creative and hands-on activities in order to help them move through any unknowns or life difficulties in a way that feels safe and structured and creative and supportive, and helps them understand that they're not alone in what they're struggling with, so they can get that peer feedback that's a helpful part of the process as well. Again, my name is Katie. I'm from creativehealingphilly.com. Thanks for listening today, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.